FBI director arrested, insulted, and extorted by racist police. 6 minutes later police begged but. FBI Director William Harper had spent the whole morning in high-stakes meetings with top government officials. He was used to long hours and intense discussions, but today's meeting felt particularly important. There had been talks of a growing threat to national security, and Harper's team had been at the center of the investigation. After finally wrapping up the session, Harper was exhausted but felt a sense of pride. His team was on the right track, and soon they would have answers. As he walked out of the building and into his sleek black car, Harper gave a small sigh of relief. The car started smoothly, and he began heading towards his office in downtown Washington, D.C. The streets were busy, but it was just another typical day for him. He had seen it all before: the crowds, the traffic, the fast pace of city life. As he passed through familiar streets, he couldn't help but think about the work that still lay ahead. But little did Harper know, this seemingly normal day would soon turn into an unforgettable experience, one that would test his patience, resilience, and sense of justice. It all started when his car was pulled over by a police squad. Harper was no stranger to law enforcement, and he was used to seeing patrol cars on the road. But today was different. The car's lights flashed behind him, signaling him to pull over. He instinctively slowed down, wondering why he had been stopped. There were no signs of any traffic violation, and he wasn't in any rush. But as the car came to a halt, something felt off. The officer who approached the vehicle wasn't the usual traffic cop Harper encountered. He was tall, with an air of confidence that seemed out of place. He tapped on the window sharply, and Harper rolled it down. The officer looked at him, his eyes scanning Harper with a kind of judgment Harper had encountered far too many times in his life. "License and registration," the officer said, his tone flat and emotionless. Harper complied, handing over his documents with a calm expression. He wasn't worried. Surely, there was some misunderstanding, perhaps his car's registration had expired or something of that nature. Harper knew this would be sorted out quickly. But as the officer glanced at the documents, his expression hardened. He didn't seem to care much about the paperwork. Instead, his eyes flickered over to Harper with an almost dismissive look. Without any reason, the officer began asking strange questions. "Where are you coming from?" he asked curtly. "What business do you have here?" Harper was taken aback for a moment. His initial response was a simple explanation: "I just left a government meeting. I'm headed back to my office." But the officer didn't seem to care about that. The questions kept coming, each one feeling more intrusive than the last. Why did the officer need to know every detail of his day? Before Harper could respond further, the officer's attitude shifted. "You think you're special just because you're in a fancy suit," he snapped. "What do you do, huh? Some big-shot lawyer or corporate bigwig?" The tone was harsh, accusing. The officer's voice grew louder with every word, and Harper could feel the tension building. For a moment, Harper couldn't understand why this officer, who was supposed to be performing his duty, was treating him like this. Was it because of his appearance? The officer clearly assumed Harper was just another ordinary person trying to get by in the world, someone he could push around. The assumption didn't sit right with Harper, but he kept his composure. He wasn't one to escalate situations unnecessarily. But things were about to take a turn for the worse. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered abruptly, his voice now colder. Harper's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right. This wasn't a routine stop, and the officer seemed to have no regard for the basic protocols he should be following. Harper could feel his pulse quickening. "Excuse me, officer, but I don't understand why you're asking me to step out." "I haven't broken any laws," Harper said calmly, keeping his voice steady despite the growing sense of unease. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exchanged a glance with the other officers nearby. Within seconds, Harper found himself being pulled from the car and handcuffed. The officer's grip was firm, and his actions were deliberate, almost as if he were waiting for a moment like this. "You're under arrest for suspicious activity," the officer declared. Harper's mind raced. Suspicious activity? This was outrageous. The officer ignored Harper's attempts to reason with him. "I haven't done anything wrong," Harper insisted. But the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he began to walk Harper towards the patrol car, his grip tightening around the handcuffs. The world around Harper seemed to blur for a moment. Was this really happening? He had dealt with dangerous criminals, corrupt officials, and countless high-pressure situations in his career, but nothing had prepared him for this. Being treated like a criminal for no reason was humiliating. As Harper was shoved into the back seat of the patrol car, the reality of what was happening set in. The officer had assumed, based on his own prejudices, that Harper wasn't who he claimed to be. He wasn't just arresting a man, he was arresting the director of the FBI, the very person who led the nation's most powerful law enforcement agency. And yet, here he was handcuffed and locked in the back of a police car. Harper felt a sense of disbelief. His mind raced, but he quickly reminded himself that he had to remain calm. He was not just any ordinary man. He was an FBI director, and he had the power to make sure this injustice would be corrected. He just had to stay composed and wait for the right moment. However, as the minutes ticked by, Harper began to feel a rising sense of anger. The officer's earlier treatment had crossed the line. The more he thought about it, the more Harper realized that the officer's actions weren't just a mistake, they were deliberate, fueled by something deeper than just ignorance. Just then, the officer turned back to look at Harper through the car window, his face twisted with disdain. "You'll learn your place soon enough," he muttered, clearly underestimating Harper's ability to handle the situation. Harper knew that something had to be done. He wasn't just going to let this go. The injustice of being wrongfully arrested, treated like a criminal, and humiliated had left him furious. But he also knew that he had to keep his cool. The moment would come when he could turn the situation around, but it wasn't yet. As he sat there, handcuffed in the back of the car, Harper couldn't help but think about the fight for justice that had brought him to his position in the FBI. He had fought for the truth his whole career. Now, more than ever, it was clear that he would have to fight for his own dignity and the truth that was at stake in this moment. As the minutes stretched on, the air in the back of the patrol car grew heavier. Harper sat quietly, his mind racing but his expression calm. He had dealt with many high-pressure situations throughout his career, but this was something else. For the first time in a long while, he felt completely out of control. He had always prided himself on his ability to manage every crisis, to handle any challenge, but this was different. He was being treated like a criminal for no reason at all. The officer who had initially pulled him over, Officer Brooks, was now sitting in the front seat, speaking with his fellow officers in low voices. They seemed to be planning their next move, but Harper couldn't help but overhear parts of their conversation. They were mocking him, laughing among themselves about how easy it had been to bring down another guy in a suit. It made Harper's blood boil. He was no ordinary person to be dismissed so casually. He was the director of the FBI, and these officers had no idea who they were dealing with. The longer Harper sat there, the more infuriated he became. He had seen corruption in law enforcement before, but this was something entirely different. It was one thing to deal with dishonest officers in the shadows, but this was in the open, with no care for the rules or respect for authority. They had arrested him for no reason other than their own assumptions. There was no excuse for this level of arrogance and abuse of power. In the back of his mind, Harper wondered whether anyone would come looking for him. His phone had been left in the car, out of reach, and he had no way of contacting anyone. He had trusted the officers to do their jobs, but they had betrayed that trust. Even if his identity as the FBI director was discovered later, would they even care? After all, it was one thing to arrest a regular citizen, but quite another to arrest someone with the kind of influence Harper had. Harper had worked his entire career to get to this point, to be a leader, a figure of authority. And now, he was being treated like a nobody. He sat there, handcuffed in the back of the patrol car, reflecting on how far he had come in life and how quickly things could go wrong. But there was one thing he knew for sure: he wasn't going to let this slide. This wasn't just about him. This was about the principle of justice, about standing up against the abuse of power. As the car drove through the city streets, Harper's thoughts were interrupted by the loud voice of Officer Brooks, who suddenly turned to him with a sarcastic grin on his face. "You know, it's always the ones who think they're above everyone else that need to be knocked down a peg," he said, his words dripping with disdain. "You FBI guys think you can do whatever you want, don't you? You've got all that power, but at the end of the day, you're just like everyone else. You think we're scared of you? We've been dealing with people like you for years." Harper's chest tightened with frustration. He had seen officers like Brooks before, people who used their badges and uniforms as shields to hide their personal biases. But this officer was different. This wasn't just about someone who resented authority. This was about someone who genuinely believed that they had the right to control others through fear and intimidation. And Harper was not going to let him get away with it. "I'm not above anyone," Harper said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "And I'm not here to cause trouble. But you need to understand that what you're doing right now is wrong. It's an abuse of power. And it's not just me you're disrespecting. It's the system you're sworn to protect." For a moment, there was silence in the car. Officer Brooks looked at Harper with a mix of surprise and irritation, but Harper didn't flinch. He knew that the officer's reaction wasn't important. What mattered was that he had spoken up, that he had drawn a line in the sand. There was no going back now. Despite the tension in the air, Harper remained calm. He wasn't going to make things worse by getting angry or raising his voice. He had been in enough high-pressure situations to know that keeping a level head was the best way to get through this. He knew that he would get out of this situation, but the officers needed to know that their actions would not be forgotten. As the car continued to drive, Harper began to hear voices outside the vehicle. He knew that they had arrived at the police station. He could hear the sounds of doors opening and closing, the murmur of voices, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the car. This was the moment of truth. The officers had stopped talking, and Harper could feel their eyes on him. There was an uncomfortable silence as the car came to a halt. The door opened, and Harper was pulled out of the vehicle. His hands were still cuffed behind his back, but he held his head high, refusing to show any sign of weakness. He wasn't going to let them see him cower. "Get inside," one of the officers barked. Harper didn't respond. He walked into the building, his steps steady, his mind clear. As he entered the police station, he couldn't help but notice the way the officers were looking at him. They were nervous, unsure of how to proceed now that they had realized who he was. "Sir, please, come with us," one of the officers said, his tone now much more respectful than before. "We'll get you sorted out." Harper didn't say anything. He wasn't there to make excuses for anyone. He had been wronged, and he intended to make sure that it was known. But he knew the officers were starting to realize the gravity of their mistake. They were beginning to panic, and Harper could feel the shift in the air. The confidence they had shown earlier was gone, replaced by uncertainty and fear. It was in this moment that Harper understood the real power of his position. He didn't need to yell or make threats. He didn't need to remind them who he was. He knew that the truth would come to light, and that in the end, justice would prevail. And when it did, the officers who had treated him with such disrespect would have no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. As they escorted him to a small office, Harper took a deep breath. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for what was right, for the principles of fairness and equality that everyone, no matter their position, deserved. And if these officers learned anything from this experience, it would be that justice couldn't be silenced by racism or corruption. As Harper stood in the small, sterile office, the atmosphere shifted again. The officers, who had been so confident just moments before, now seemed tense and unsure of themselves. They avoided looking him directly in the eyes, shuffling papers and muttering quietly among themselves. Harper remained standing tall, his posture straight, his expression calm but firm. His mind was already working, calculating the best way to handle this situation. He had been in tough spots before, but this was different. This wasn't just a criminal case or an investigation. This was personal. These officers had humiliated him, underestimated him, and tried to take advantage of their position. And that wasn't something Harper was going to let go unnoticed. As the director of the FBI, he wasn't just fighting for his own reputation, he was fighting for the integrity of law enforcement, for the fairness that should be the cornerstone of the justice system. The silence in the room stretched on. The officers shuffled around nervously, exchanging quick glances. They seemed to be unsure of what to do next. Some of them were still trying to maintain their tough exterior, while others looked like they wanted to apologize but didn't know how. Harper could see the fear in their eyes. They had no idea what was coming. Minutes later, an officer who had been in the back of the room stepped forward, his voice tentative. "Sir, we need to get you processed. We'll sort everything out in a moment." Harper didn't respond immediately. He could feel the power shift in the room. These officers had assumed they were in control, but now they were the ones who were afraid. They had made a huge mistake by underestimating him, and now they had to deal with the consequences of their actions. As they led him to another room, Harper remained composed. The officers were trying their best to act normal, but he could see the cracks in their armor. They were beginning to understand just how serious the situation had become. They had no idea who they had arrested, and now that they were starting to realize their mistake, there was no going back. They sat Harper down in an uncomfortable chair in a small, dimly lit room. The officer who had first arrested him, Officer Brooks, paced back and forth, clearly uncomfortable. His movements were jerky, and his voice cracked as he tried to speak. "Look, we didn't know who you were," Brooks said, his tone almost pleading. "We thought you were just some guy, you know? Just a regular person." Harper didn't let him finish. "You didn't know who I was?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with an edge of disbelief. "You didn't even bother to check? You just assumed I was just some guy? You arrested me for what? Because of the way I look? Because of your prejudices? Is that how law enforcement works now?" Brooks stopped pacing, clearly taken aback by the sharpness of Harper's words. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. The other officers in the room stood awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot. Harper could see that they were beginning to feel the weight of their mistake. He could feel their discomfort growing. "I don't think you fully understand the situation you're in," Harper continued. "Do you realize who I am? Who you've been treating like a criminal?" The room fell silent again. Harper's words hung in the air, and the officers shifted uncomfortably. It was clear that none of them had any idea what they had just done. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who had the authority to make their lives very difficult. But Harper wasn't here to make threats. He wasn't here to gloat. He was here to ensure that justice was done. He had to make sure that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated, especially not from those who were supposed to protect and serve. Finally, one of the officers spoke up, his voice shaky. We didn't mean any harm. We didn't know. We just thought you thought," Harper interrupted. "That's the problem right there. You thought. You didn't take the time to find out the truth. You didn't care about the truth. You just saw someone, and based on your own biases, you decided to treat them like a criminal. The officer fell silent again, and Harper could see the shame on his face. The officer was beginning to realize the severity of the situation. But the damage had already been done. They had arrested the director of the FBI, humiliated him, and tried to extort money from him, all because of their own ignorance and racism. As the minutes ticked by, Harper could see that the officers were starting to crack. They knew that they had done something unforgivable. They could no longer hide behind their badges. The truth had been revealed, and now they were the ones who had to answer for their actions. "I don't think you understand," Harper said, his voice calmer now but still filled with authority. "This isn't just about me. This is about the integrity of law enforcement. You're supposed to protect the people, not abuse your power." One of the officers, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. We understand, sir. We made a mistake. We didn't know who you were. We're sorry." Harper didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The apology was hollow. It wasn't about the apology. It was about the realization that this kind of behavior could no longer be swept under the rug. The officer's actions had exposed a deep flaw in the system, and it was up to people like Harper to make sure that change happened. The door to the room opened, and another officer stepped in. "We've checked the records," the officer said, looking at Harper with newfound respect. "You're the director of the FBI. This is a serious mistake." Harper nodded. "I know. But the question is, what are you going to do about it?" The officers looked at each other, uncertain. Harper had already made his decision. This wasn't just about one bad experience, it was about a larger issue. It was about holding people accountable for their actions, no matter who they were or what their job title was. "I'll be reporting this incident to my superiors," Harper said, his voice firm. "This will be investigated. And the people responsible for this will face the consequences of their actions." The officers in the room were silent. They had no response. They understood that this wasn't just a small mistake. It was a betrayal of everything they were supposed to stand for. And now, they had to face the consequences. As Harper stood up, ready to leave the room, he could see the fear in the officers' eyes. They knew that their careers were on the line, and they knew that they had no one to blame but themselves. But Harper wasn't done yet. He wasn't going to let them off easy. This was only the beginning. The room was still, filled with a palpable tension. The officers, once so confident and brash, were now sitting quietly, their eyes shifting nervously from one another. They no longer carried the arrogance they had shown earlier when they arrested Harper. The realization of their mistake, the weight of what they had done, was now settling in. Harper had watched this shift in their demeanor, and he could see it clearly. They knew they had made a serious error, and now, they were unsure of how to fix it. Harper stood tall, his hands still cuffed behind his back, but he didn't show any signs of discomfort. His mind was sharp and focused. It had always been his ability to stay calm under pressure that made him effective in his role. He had faced danger, conflict, and numerous challenges over the years, but nothing like this. This was different. This was personal. And in this moment, he wasn't just the director of the FBI, he was someone who had been wronged, and he was going to make sure justice was served, not just for himself, but for the integrity of the justice system. The silence stretched on, and Harper felt the eyes of the officers on him. They had realized their mistake, but they still didn't know what to do about it. The fear in their eyes wasn't just because of the gravity of the situation, it was because they knew they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. They had tried to extort a man who held the power to bring down an entire department. The realization hit them harder than any reprimand or punishment ever could. Finally, one of the officers, the one who had been the most vocal earlier, spoke up. His voice was quieter now, filled with uncertainty. "Sir, we didn't know who you were. We were just doing our job, trying to keep the peace, but we made a mistake. We never should have treated you like that. We know that now. Harper looked at him, his gaze steady and unyielding. Do you understand what you've done? He asked. The officer nodded, but Harper could see the weight of his own words had sunk in. You didn't just arrest someone you didn't recognize. You arrested the director of the FBI. You arrested someone who's worked his whole life to uphold justice. And you did it because of your assumptions. Because you thought you were in control. But now, you've learned that you're not. The officer looked down, clearly embarrassed, but Harper wasn't done yet. This wasn't just a mistake. This was an abuse of power. The system is built on trust, on fairness. You can't just treat people like this. I don't care who they are or where they come from. You're supposed to be the ones protecting people, not humiliating them. Harper's words hung in the air, heavy and firm. The officers didn't speak. They were beginning to understand the gravity of their actions. But Harper wasn't looking for a simple apology or a few words of regret. This needed to be addressed. There had to be consequences for what they had done, or else this behavior would continue. He wasn't just angry about what had happened to him. He was angry for everyone who had been treated unfairly, who had been judged before being given a chance to prove themselves. I'm going to report this, Harper said firmly. I'm going to make sure this is investigated. You can apologize all you want, but it doesn't change the fact that you violated the very principles of law and order. And there will be consequences. There was a long pause before the officer spoke again, his voice small and hesitant. What happens now? He asked. What do we do? Harper didn't hesitate. You're going to do what you should have done in the first place. You're going to learn. You're going to face the consequences. But most importantly, you're going to understand that this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been wronged by people like you. The officer looked like he was about to say something more, but before he could, another voice interrupted. It was one of the higher-ranking officers, someone Harper hadn't seen before. He stepped into the room, his expression more serious than the others. I'm here to take over the situation, the officer said, his voice calm but authoritative. I've heard what's been going on, and I'm going to make sure that this is handled properly. He looked at Harper. Sir, I apologize for what's happened. We will make sure this is dealt with in a way that reflects the seriousness of the situation. Harper nodded. He appreciated the man's tone, but he wasn't going to let it go easily. I'm glad to hear that. But let's be clear here. This isn't just about me being inconvenienced or embarrassed. This is about the integrity of the system. If you allow this to slide, then you're telling everyone that it's okay to treat people like this. And that's not acceptable. The higher-ranking officer took a deep breath, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. I understand. And I assure you, we're going to take this very seriously. There will be an investigation, and if anyone is found to be responsible for these actions, they will face appropriate consequences. Harper looked at him for a long moment, studying his face. He didn't need to say anything more. The officer's response was the right one. He was taking responsibility, acknowledging the problem, and promising to address it. That was what mattered now. The officers who had mistreated him would be held accountable, and the system would be held to a higher standard because of it. As Harper stood there, he realized that this experience had changed something in him. He had always believed in the system, in the fairness of the law. But today, he had seen how easily that system could be corrupted. He had seen how quickly a few bad actors could turn justice into something else entirely. It wasn't enough to just trust the system. It was necessary to challenge it when it went wrong, to stand up for what was right, even when it meant facing adversity. I'll be expecting a full report, Harper said, his voice calm but filled with authority. And I'll be involved in every step of this process. I want to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again. The officers nodded, and Harper could see that they were beginning to understand. This wasn't just about a mistake, it was about changing the culture within law enforcement. It was about ensuring that everyone, no matter who they were, would be treated with respect and fairness. As Harper walked out of the room, he felt a sense of resolve. He knew that this wasn't the end of the journey, it was just the beginning. There would be more work to do, more people to hold accountable. But for now, he had taken the first step in ensuring that the system would work as it was meant to, with integrity, fairness, and justice for all. The following day, the events of the previous evening still weighed heavily on William Harper's mind. He had expected many things during his long career, but being wrongfully arrested and mistreated by law enforcement was not one of them. As he drove home that evening, he thought about how quickly things could spiral out of control, how easily those in power could misuse their authority if left unchecked. But he also realized that he was in a unique position to make sure this didn't happen again, not just for himself, but for everyone else who had ever been mistreated by those who were meant to protect them. The next morning, Harper walked into his office with a renewed sense of purpose. His team was already hard at work on various national security cases, but today, his attention was entirely focused on something else. Today, he had to hold people accountable. It wasn't just about his own experience, it was about making sure that what had happened to him didn't happen to anyone else. He sat at his desk, his hands steepled in front of him, as he began to map out the next steps. He needed to make sure the right people were informed about the events of the previous day, and he needed to ensure that a full investigation into the officers involved would be launched. The first thing he did was contact his superiors. They needed to be aware of the situation and know that Harper was committed to ensuring that the officers involved faced the consequences of their actions. He wasn't doing this for revenge, he was doing it because the system had to be held to a higher standard. No one should be above the law. Within hours, the case was brought to the attention of senior government officials, and an investigation into the officers began. The response from the higher UPS was swift. The officers involved were suspended, pending a thorough investigation. Harper knew this was just the beginning. This case would set a precedent, and he would make sure that it did. But even as the investigation began, Harper knew that the journey wasn't over. In many ways, it had just started. He began receiving phone calls and messages of support from colleagues, law enforcement agencies, and even members of the public. People who had once been skeptical of his leadership now expressed their admiration for the way he had handled the situation. They respected his calmness under pressure and his unwavering commitment to justice. But for Harper, it wasn't about praise or admiration, it was about something more important. It was about ensuring that this incident became a turning point in how law enforcement operated. Later that week, Harper was asked to speak at a meeting with members of Congress about the incident. The room was filled with lawmakers, police chiefs, and other influential figures. Harper had been in countless meetings like this before, but this one felt different. The eyes of the country were on him. The stakes were high. He took the floor and began to speak, his voice steady but filled with conviction. What happened to me was not just an unfortunate event, it was a symptom of a much larger problem, he said. A problem that we've ignored for far too long. This isn't just about a few bad apples, this is about the culture within law enforcement that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. He paused for a moment, allowing his words to settle in. He could feel the weight of the room's attention, but he wasn't intimidated. He had seen far worse during his career, and this was a fight worth having. We can't afford to let this go, Harper continued. We can't allow these kinds of actions to become the norm. Law enforcement officers are sworn to protect the public, but how can we trust them if they're not held accountable for their actions? How can we expect the public to trust them if they're allowed to operate with impunity? The room was silent as Harper's words echoed. He could see that the lawmakers were listening, but he knew that it wasn't enough for them to just hear his words, they needed to act. And that's when he made a call for change. I'm asking for a national review of law enforcement practices, he said. A review that focuses on accountability, transparency, and fairness. We need to ensure that every officer, no matter their rank or position, is held to the highest standards. This is about building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. After Harper finished speaking, there was a long silence. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of reflection. Finally, a few lawmakers spoke up, agreeing with Harper's points. There was a consensus in the room that change was needed. Some called for stronger oversight, others advocated for more training and reform. But they all agreed that something had to be done. Harper had sparked a conversation that was long overdue. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into the officers continued. The evidence was undeniable: the officers had abused their power, treated Harper unfairly, and attempted to extort him. They were arrested and faced serious charges. But the investigation didn't stop there. It opened the door to a wider examination of law enforcement practices across the country. Harper's actions had sparked a nationwide conversation about the need for reform, and the momentum for change grew stronger every day. As for Harper, he continued to lead the FBI with the same dedication and commitment he always had. But he also became a leading voice for law enforcement reform. His experience had opened his eyes to the flaws in the system, and he knew that he couldn't ignore them. He began working closely with lawmakers, advocacy groups, and law enforcement agencies to develop new policies that would ensure fairness, accountability, and transparency in policing. Months later, as Harper looked back on the events that had started with his wrongful arrest, he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The officers involved had been held accountable, and their actions had set in motion a movement for change. More importantly, the conversation about justice, fairness, and accountability had started, and it wasn't going to stop. Harper knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but he was ready for it. After all, this was what he had dedicated his life to, ensuring that justice was not just an ideal, but a reality for everyone. In the end, Harper's experience had become more than just a story of personal struggle. It had become a turning point in the fight for justice. And as he looked ahead, he knew that the work wasn't over. It was just beginning.